May God bless the sharing and the hearing of His Word today as we pause for a few moments and take a look at this section of Scripture from the book of Acts. Came across a story about a family who was driving a large camper, and they pulled up in front of a church just as the pastor was leaving to go home. And the pastor thought he'd be friendly, and so he walked up and greeted the family, said hello to them, and expressed his admiration for the camper. He said, "This is really a nice camper that you have here." And the man driving it says, "Oh yes," he said, we love this camper. We take it a lot of places. It's just a great camper for us, and it sleeps 8 people. And he said to the pastor, "By the way, what's the capacity of your church?" And the pastor said, "Well, it sleeps about 80. Yeah, I say that because, one thing about it on Pentecost Sunday is those disciples were in that upper room, and as events were happening in Jerusalem, the city that day, I'll guarantee you no one was sleeping. No one was sleeping. We see that scene as the disciples are gathered together there in that room, waiting. What are they waiting for? They didn't know. Jesus said, "Go together in one place and wait." And at that point in time, God will present His Spirit to you. So they waited. I'm sure they might have been a little anxious, maybe a little fearful. They had no idea what to expect. They did not know what was going to happen. For all they knew, maybe Jesus was going to come back and this was going to be it. But they waited. And all of a sudden, there was a windstorm. And then they watched, and then there were tongues as of fire, as it's described here. That's the best way they could put it into words. And it looked as though those tongues rested on those individuals gathered together there. And they began to speak. They began to speak in languages that other people understood, their own native language, for there were people from all neighboring countries there in Jerusalem that day. And they heard what they were saying in their own language from this group of Galileans who, by no other explanation, would have been able to speak what they were speaking unless it was by the power of God Himself. And so they're listening to them in this language. And we see that as they do this, people respond and they listen to what's being said, and there's excitement. Excitement that came from a newly discovered power for life. A newly discovered power for life that came from God Himself. We talk about power surges and those spurts of power. Well, this was the original power surge before the electricity was invented. And it wasn't by Ohio Edison, but it was a power surge that was developed by the very Spirit of God Himself. And it's a power surge that continues even today within the church. That's the power of God's Spirit. That discovery of a new power for living itself. And it tells us later on that first day alone, out of what was happening that day, 3,000 were added to the church, brought into that church that day. I think it's great that we have this opportunity to bring our confirmands and as members to the church this day. And to do that on Pentecost Sunday, because it was a birth of the church. I just want to take a few moments and take a look at that day and look at some of the dynamics that were going on. Some of the things that were happening that they're a part of even the church today, as God designed it, as God desires it. As we look at this, I think one of the first things I notice as I read through this scripture is the nature of those disciples. Because you see what those followers did, they simply opened their lives up to the presence and the Spirit of this living God. That was the first step. They had to make a choice, a decision, to place themselves into God's hands in faithfulness and follow those things which God was calling them. And that's what they did. They were there out of their faithfulness to God. And that's what's happening in that upper room. Their faithfulness to Him. And how important that was and what was going on in that place. An important event. An important time. You look at what's happening there, and they open themselves up to God's Spirit, and that Spirit empowered them. And that dynamic is even true today. As we open our lives to God, He fills us with His power and His Spirit. And you know, one thing we have to understand about God is it's a decision that we have to make to open ourselves up to Him in faith. You know, God's really a gracious person. God is really gracious. Because you see, God won't enter into our lives if we don't open the door for Him to come in. But that's what was happening here. They were there waiting for that presence of God's Spirit to fill them. Whatever that may have been, they were there ready and waiting and open to that. And when it came, they came to truly discover and find out that all things were possible to those who believe. Paul talks about that. He says that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. It's that strength of God's Spirit that enables us to do that. But you know, when we listen to that, we have to understand the dynamics of what that means in itself. Being open to God and our faithfulness to Him. Now, one of the things we have to realize is that doesn't mean that all of our problems are going to be solved and all of our questions are going to be answered. It doesn't necessarily mean that, because you see, our Christian faith is not a magical cure. It's not a magical cure for all the answers and all the things that we need to have resolved in our lives. It doesn't necessarily do that. But rather, I like what Ed Stelzer said in an article that I was reading, an author. He said, we need to teach people that the Christian life is not always explainable, but it is always livable. It's livable in all the circumstances of life. Meaning we continue to be faithful in God. You know, I think of back in Daniel chapter 3. I love that chapter because of what it presents. You know, we see that King Nebuchadnezzar, he built this golden image of himself, and he decreed that when the trumpet sounds, when the instruments begin to play, everyone is to pause and to bow down and to worship that idol, that God, in reverence to him and his kingdom. One day, some of his advisors came in and said, King, there are some people in leadership in your kingdom that aren't doing that. And he said, bring them here. I need to talk to them. And so in comes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the king says to them, now, you know I made this decree. When the trumpet sounds, when the instruments begin to play, you need to bow down and worship to that God. After you do that, you can do whatever you want. But you need to do that. If you do, then everything's going to be fine. If not, I have this furnace of fire that you'll be placed in. They respond to the king. He says, no, king, this God that we serve, he can deliver us from that fire. He can deliver us from your hand. They have faith and trust and confidence that God can do that. They put their faith and trust in him. And then I like what it says next. 3 simple words. 3 simple words from these 3 to the king. God can deliver us. God can deliver us from your hand, from the fire. And then they say, but if not. But if not.